Well, we've been talking about biblical critical theory, and in this next objective, over the course of about an hour, we're going to scan a huge block of material and learn as much as we can about the original life setting of the Bible text. Because biblical critical theory believes that we can give the fullest interpretation only by doing so. So this objective should also equip us to appreciate the biblical critical discussion that we'll discover in the very best commentaries and in the secondary research material used in Bible interpretation. So biblical criticism really is a series of questions that we ask of the text. That we try to draw out of the text the answers to this set of questions. What is the literary genre? What kind of text are we reading? Prose, poetry? When and where did a particular text originate? What is its provenance? How, why, by whom, and for whom, and in what circumstances was it produced, composed and edited and collected and then reused in the form of Bible? What influences or sources were used in its composition and preservation? What literary backgrounds and cultural antecedents should be known that affect the message that it was intended to convey? What lexical and syntactical factors are known to have contributed to the meaning of the words, and then the way that the words are used and put together? And why is a particular text preserved in its collection that we have? And what is known of its history and integrity? Are there linguistic, archaeological, anthropological, social, geographical, comparative, religious, or political factors affecting the meaning of the text? These are some of the questions that we ask to try to understand the Bible's original setting. Most of what we're going to discuss is called form criticism. What is the form of the literature that we're reading? So we'll approach it from a literary perspective, but then we'll want to also extend ourselves back in time to understand the culture and the societies in which the text itself was used. Now, let's discuss briefly some of the backgrounds, why we would ask these questions of the text. Cannot the Bible text speak plainly and on its own without the aid of some of these biblical critical theories? And the answer to that is yes, devotionally. Anyone, I believe, with the proper mindset and spiritual condition can experience the presence of God with just a personal reading and without the aid of interpretive helps. That's not what this particular seminar is about. This seminar is about exegesis and understanding that fuller meaning of the text that biblical critical theory attempts to give us. Now, between 1906 and 1917, we can just go back about 100 years in time, back to a previous century's biblical scholarship. It became very important to discover the life setting of the biblical text, because some of the approaches of the 19th century were beginning to get a little bit stale. For example, source criticism was all the rage for several decades. Julius Wellhausen, in the last part of the 1800s, he started this global movement that still is important today in Bible scholarship, when he proposed that there were several documents lying behind the text of the Old Testament that were composed and compiled and edited, finally collected into the Pentateuch. And pretty soon everyone was hypothesizing these kind of theoretical documents that could be discerned in certain blocks of Old Testament materials, with editorial and connecting parts that redaction critical and source critical theories explain. Now, in New Testament studies, which is where we're going to try to focus, source criticism was an attempt really to get behind the Gospels, to know something better about the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, and especially about the early church that produced those documents that we call the Gospels. Because there was a lag time of at least a generation, maybe up to 2 generations, between the time of Christ's death, resurrection, and ascension, and then the actual writing down of the Gospels. The early church, it was assumed by the 19th century, had really invented a lot of things, and therefore the Gospels may not be entirely trustworthy. And there was an assumption in this 19th century biblical scholarship that the earliest, more accurate sources could be found behind the Gospels, or as sources that inspired the Gospels. And they assumed that if we could know about the sources, then we would know something better about the historical Jesus. And again, the assumption is that there was development between the time of the historical Jesus and the time of the Christ, the Messiah depicted by the early church. And so began the so-called quest for the historical Jesus, which continues in an important project today called the Jesus Seminar. Turns out that what was believed to be the earliest written sources, Mark and a document that we do not have called Q, these had actually incorporated even older material. Mark and Q had been drawing from other sources. We no longer have access to them, only Mark and Q. Mark did not compose his material from scratch or invent it out of his head, but he was drawing from traditions that he himself had at his disposal about the deeds and the teachings and the life and death of Jesus. Now Luke, who was drawing from Mark, and I believe others, admittedly had at his disposal a collection like that just as well. In fact, he acknowledged that in the very first verses of his Gospels, something like, since so many others have set out to write down an orderly account of Jesus, basically he says, I thought I'd give it a shot myself. That's in Luke chapter 1. But what scholars needed at the turn of the 20th century was a tool to get behind those earliest written documents that would give us some insights into what was happening in the early churches. That's what we are really interested in, is Christian origins. What was happening among the very first followers of Jesus, perhaps those who themselves had heard Jesus preach and had witnessed some of the events of his life. Things that shaped material about Jesus that we do have. There was about, as I said, a generation or so, and we can tell that a lot was going on there in that first generation, and as the first Christians were dying and passing on their traditions to their children and the subsequent believers. But listen, our access to those years is only indirect. And yet there are certain things that biblical critical theory says we can derive from these assumed sources. So the tools for that project became known as form criticism. And form criticism, headed by Hermann Gunkel, one of Wellhausen's students, by the first years of the 20th century, was a sort of response to the limits of source criticism. Now, for New Testament studies, we're thinking of Schmidt, Debelius, Bultmann, and some of these others that we've been reading about. And I'm assuming that you have read and are prepared for the discussion afterwards. So those were leaders in the form critical approaches to the New Testament. So while earlier 19th century source critical results certainly proved interesting and carried the discussion in the academy forward quite a ways, it helped to explain some of the difficulties with the Bible text. It really did not add much to the meaning, and especially to the hermeneutical goal of interpretation, that's giving meaning and applying the message of the Bible to our life. Form criticism helped in getting back to the meaning of the Bible, recentering on the text of the Bible and the culture from which it is derived. And understanding the kind of literature goes a long way to bring the meaning to life. Whereas knowing the background sources used in the Bible's composition wasn't so helpful in terms of meaning, in terms of relating the meaning to our times, that is. So I think we could all do perhaps a simple form critical exercise just to illustrate what's going on in this particular endeavor of how we can bring a fuller interpretation of the Bible through this particular approach to biblical studies, form criticism. Let's just use a non-biblical example, and then we'll find some biblical examples. So keep your New Testaments handy. But if I were to begin telling you a story, and I began with the phrase, once upon a time, well, there are certain things that you can assume about the rest of the story. For example, how do you think that story will end exactly? Yeah, they lived happily ever after. Right. So you already know the end and perhaps some of the elements or the form of that particular story just by knowing the very first phrase of the story. Now tell me something about that story. In the beginning, or once upon a time, the story begins and then it ends, and they lived happily ever after. Let's fill in some of the blanks. We can assume that it's a fairy tale type of children's story. Often it's read at night in the context of family time, a parent reading the story to a child. There's typically some kind of moral content involved. Red Riding Hood was taught not to talk to strangers. The Three Little Pigs not to be lazy and to build your best. There are coming-of-age elements, as in Cinderella. There's the short story with typical narrative elements. There's a certain kind of character involved in these short stories that begin once upon a time and that end they lived happily ever after, with a very simple plot including a kind of drama. There's conflict, a certain way that conflict is resolved, leading to that classical fairy tale epitaph, happily ever after. So there's a lot of elements we can discover about a story just by knowing its first line. Very much similar to what we're trying to do with biblical criticism. We find discrete elements within the text that will open up for us some more kinds of things that we can understand about the text and some directions, at least, for interpretation. There's other examples that we could apply. This morning I wrote a letter and the opening line was, "Dear Sir or Madam." Now with that you can understand that I'm writing a letter. You already would have assumed that. That happened to be I was writing a letter of reference and recommendation, although something similar could also be found in a letter of interest if you were applying for a job or something. So we discover that we can find certain elements of a text, its meaning, how it's used, etc., just by knowing certain elements of it. So what you need to know is that, first off, the literary form or genre, it's sort of the vehicle that's conveying some kind of meaning that needs to be interpreted. And the form or genre will tell us about other elements within the text. Similarly, the elements of the text then can suggest to us what kind of literature we're dealing with. So we can start with a broad, what kind of literature, and discover certain elements in the text, or we can find smaller discrete elements in the text and then extrapolate what kind of broader literature that should be found in. Now let's get very practical. In the study of the New Testament, form criticism has two tasks, and we'll develop our understanding of these two tasks. The first task is the literary task, and the second task is the historical task. So these are the tasks of form criticism. One, literary. Two, historical. So, when we discuss the literary task of form criticism, our real goal there, the task that we're attempting to do is to identify and to understand the conventions by which the story of Jesus and the story of the early church were communicated. How did they talk? How did they discuss this? And in what contexts was that discussion done? The second task, the historical task, what we're trying to accomplish there, we're trying to derive the purpose of form criticism, which is to get behind the large literary sources that might be identified. We mentioned Q, we mentioned Mark, etc., as the earliest. And then to describe what was happening as the pre-literary traditions were handed on from person to person, and then community to community, in the sense of stories and narratives that were passed on, perhaps as oral form. In some cases, they were written down. We believe that. But this historical task of form criticism is an attempt to move source critical and documentary theory approaches beyond its previous limits. So this task is understood as form criticism, or understanding, assessing, analyzing, not criticizing or belittling, but assessing and talking and thinking about the form in which the meaning of the Bible is communicated. If we achieve these two tasks or goals, the task of literary understandings and historical understandings, we should arrive at what we call a Sitz-im-Leben. Sitz-im-Leben. If we can get these two tasks, we'll get the sitz. That's the setting. That's what we're talking about here. We're trying to find its original life setting, its place in history. The interpretation describing a typical situation within a community so that the meaning of the text is bound up with its function in the original community and its social context. Once we begin to mine some of the richness of this out, then we'll have a fuller understanding of its interpretation for us today. Now, this approach to biblical criticism describes what occasions certain passages in the Bible were written for. Examples of its life setting, or Sitz-im-Leben, include the classification of material into gospel, into letters or epistles, poems and hymns, parables, psalms and songs that are contained within the books of the Bible, or the New Testament. However, Sitz-im-Leben, that is ascertaining the text's life setting, also involves asking who the speaker of the passage was, his role in life, the nature of the audience, and so on. Taken out of its original context, the original meaning of the passage is lost, and then we're left only with our own very limited, modern, time-bound type of interpretation. We want to understand not only what it might mean for us today, but what it did mean and what it has meant through the ages. So, for example, a psalm or hymn in the New Testament may have a sitz, or setting, in the original worship of the early church. For the Old Testament, the original setting of a particular passage, if it's a hymn or psalm, let's say in the book of Psalms, was likely in the ritual of the temple cult, or as an artistic votive offering, or in the sense of injustice, just rising from a power structure in Jerusalem society, or perhaps in the context of a lament or a defeat. Others were used in the context of the enthronement of a king, or annual kinds of observances. And so what we're doing in exegesis, in this form criticism, is trying to uncover such things as how a particular text or narrative tradition may have been used originally. Now, a few more examples. At my house, we subscribe to Guideposts magazine. And I know a few others here do as well. Actually, that's not quite true. My mom buys a gift subscription for us every year, and she's done that for 22 years now. She's sent Guideposts to our house, and we get that every month, and we read that. Now, if you don't know, Guideposts is full of these short, inspirational stories. They're between 1 and 4 pages long, very short and interesting. They are described as true stories, at least true to the experience of the authors. And anyone could submit an article to Guideposts and have it published in there. Anyone could submit an article, and there's a little outline that manuscript submissions have to comply with. So if you submit an article to Guideposts, you'll need to have your writing comply with, and have all the different features listed in the submission guidelines. So every story actually has the same exact features, and it's almost as if you've read one story in Guideposts, you've read them all. But just my opinion, I still read those, and I still find inspiration in those stories. But I always read them at the same time of day and in the same place. There's a certain time when I just have a few moments to myself, and I sit down in my chair and I'll read one of those stories. And they provoke small talk with others who've read them, and I find that they kind of have the same pattern in their life of finding these short moments to read a short, very simple, inspirational story. And there's certain things we can discern about not only the authors of those stories, but the readers of those stories, me being one. That's a kind of form criticism playing out in our everyday life. Sort of like those chicken soup for the soul books. There's a lot that can be said about the readership of those books. Same thing with the Left Behind series of Christian fiction. They have a certain kind of stylized form. The Bible, too, is made up of a lot of very typical forms of literature. And once we've identified those forms, either a passage, in some cases very small, discrete units, then we can also begin to understand quite a bit about the readers, the hearers, and the writers of those stories. And so we'll take a very short break, perhaps a 10-minute break, and then we'll get back into this very soon.